and thank you for joining us for downtown discussions on the subject of climate change and downtown Long Beach. I'm Brock Coward, and I'm with the Downtown Long Beach Alliance. DLBA, as we're often called, created downtown discussions out of a desire to share information during different stages of the pandemic. And it's morphed into a roundtable discussions on timely issues, such as public realm and in a post-pandemic world, a digital divide in Long Beach, the Black experience, women in the workplace, and now here in April, on the tail end of Earth Day, we take up the ever-present issue for a coastal city such as Long Beach of climate change. Climate change has been getting greater attention in the last couple of months, with the US rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement in February and President Biden hosting 40 world leaders for a climate summit just last week. However, the work has been ongoing. And over the last 2 decades, at least, various levels of government and agencies, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector have been confronting challenges and making progress on topics related to climate change, such as clean air emissions, renewable energy, energy efficient construction, and just in general, reducing our carbon footprint. Today's discussion, and downtown discussion, it focuses on a few of those pivotal players and their efforts to support a healthier, more sustainable Long Beach, while ensuring that it remains a viable economic engine. And before we get started, I just want to thank our board of directors for their support, and also our staff who goes beyond the call of duty in bringing us these discussions and our virtual events. We have a great group of panelists, so let's jump into it with our moderator today for this discussion, Stephen Groener. He's the founder and president of SGA Marketing in downtown Long Beach. In fact, he's right above DLBA, a few floors up. And Stephen's lengthy experience includes directing community engagement programs on issues including water, housing, environmental justice, and public health. So we thought he'd be a perfect moderator for today. An environmental engineer by trade, which I didn't know about you, Stephen. That's a little interesting fact. His firm works specifically on environmental behavior change issues. And I know this topic's near and dear to his heart. So with that, let me turn it over to Stephen, and he can get on with our guest. Stephen?
Thanks, Brock, and thanks for having me. Yeah, this is a very important issue and obviously huge issue internationally, but also how do we look at this from an individual perspective and kind of a micro local perspective for downtown Long Beach? And we have a great panel of guests. Let me start with Dr. Peter Kareva, who's the president and CEO of the Aquarium of the Pacific. He brings really quite of expertise to the discussion. Before joining the Aquarium of the Pacific in August 2020, Dr. Kareva served as director of the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA, and previously was the vice president of science for the Nature Conservancy. Dr. Kareva holds a BA in zoology, MS in environmental biology, and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology. So certainly covers a lot of the science side of the conversation. Also, we have two folks from the city of Long Beach, kind of planners, Jennifer Lee, who's a planner at the Department of Development Services. She's staff lead for the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. She previously worked with the City of Los Angeles Department of Transportation in support of the bus electrification program and transit service expansion plan. Jennifer has a master's in city planning from MIT and a bachelor's in conservation and resource studies from Berkeley. And then we also have Allison Spindler Ruiz. She's advanced planner at the city, oversees the advanced planning division at the Department of Development Services, which is responsible for long range environmental planning, historic preservation programs. She helped lead the development of Long Beach's Climate Action and Adaptation Plan and has helped develop several other city planning elements as well. She's an adjunct professor at planning at USC and has a master's from USC in urban planning and public administration. Then we also have Todd Lemus, who's a founding partner at Pacific 6. Todd is quite the Renaissance man. He Navy veteran, musician, lawyer. He worked in HR. He's an author. Again, one of the founding partners of Pacific Six Enterprises, a Long Beach-based impact investment and development firm. He holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from UCLA. Philosophy, very, very useful in this conversation, as well as a Juris Doctorate from Southwestern Law School. He sits on the board of several nonprofits, including the Long Beach Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Long Beach Public Library Foundation, Seal Beach Police League, and our own DLBA, the Downtown Long Beach Alliance. And then last but not least, we have Matt Arms, who's the Director of Environmental Planning Division at the Port of Long Beach. Matt is directly responsible for Green Port Policy and the San Pedro Bay Port Clean Air Action Plan. He earned his bachelor's degree in environmental science from Washington State University. So Matt, welcome as well. Let me start the conversation and kind of opening it up with Dr. Peter Kareva to kind of maybe frame the conversation a little bit on what have been the effects thus far with climate change, whether kind of regionally or even possibly locally in downtown Long Beach.
Sure, I think, I've read the Climate Action Plan, and it does a really good job nailing exactly the themes everybody always talks about: heat, air quality, drought, and sea level rise. And I want to, because we're so used to those, I want to take a little different twist on it. I think the thing that's going to surprise Long Beach, I moved here in August, and Doug Otto, one of the board members, told me, well, Long Beach is the most beautiful climate in California. He talked about the winds and, how it's hotter or colder. And he was right. It's a special circumstance. And when you live in such a place where people have chosen for the climate, you kind of think, we're not going to get hurt that much. But it's just the opposite, actually. It's just the opposite. It's the perfect climates that are not going to be potentially ready for it. So I see what the two big things that sometimes don't get enough emphasis, although I know you're all aware of them and everybody who lives here, are wildfires. When that smoke from that wildfires, that fine particle smoke, I showed up here in August and we had that bobcat fire in September here in Long Beach, and our staff had to wear masks or we didn't go outside, and there were no visitors to the aquarium. It was open then. It shuts down activity. It shuts down schools, and the health impacts of that fine particle smoke on children is enormous and can last a lifespan. And those wildfires are not going to go away. We're going to be having more and more of them, and we could just expect that. And we need to think about our schools, our kids, sensors for air quality and things like that. The other thing that gets sort of understated, we all know about heat waves and trees and shade and reflective building materials. Well, the biggest impact of heat waves is at night. And it's really on sleep. So the World Health Organization says the optimum temperature to sleep at is 65 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know, Tom Brady markets these pajamas that he says keeps them at 65 degrees, and he calls it, revive, restore, and win. He sells them for $200. But sleep, if you don't have air conditioning, it sets back kids in school. There's a huge inequity here. I don't know what percent, I was trying to figure it out, Long Beach has air conditioning. It used to be in Southern California, only 15% of the houses had air conditioning. Now it's up to about 50%. But that air conditioning to provide sleep for your kids is incredibly important. And there's, just like everything else, it's where inequity really plays out. And if you have air conditioning, no problem, you do well in school. You don't have air conditioning, it's a big problem. You don't do so well in school, a feedback loop. So that's, heat, air quality, drought, and sea level rise, but these two special twists on it, wildfires, which we will see here, and we have seen, and those, it's a cool coastal community. People don't think to have air conditioning. In the absence of that, the loss of sleep at night takes a huge toll. And the last point I would make about the timing of this is a message that I wish even Biden and all the global leaders haven't quite gotten this across yet. But what's unique about climate change now is it's got positive feedback loops. It's like a runaway train. And so the more warming you get, the more ice that melts. So the water's dark and the more warming you get, even if you don't add any more emissions. It's not like other pollution. You add DDT, you don't get more DDT. With warming, it's a positive feedback. And because of that, we really have to stop that runaway train fast. And we have to go after things like methane and nitrous oxide, not just carbon dioxide. And there's an urgency because of this acceleration. And we're not getting that picture across enough. So, that's what I would say. Urgency because of acceleration. And let's worry about wildfires and those evening temperatures.
Okay, thanks. I mean, that really kind of sets the stage of the importance of what we're dealing with. And certainly it's going to take a lot of individuals to think about this. Let me start with Matt and thinking about the port complex and really frame it in the sense of, on the one hand, we want what we have. We're living in this modern economy. The port is an essential part of that. It provides jobs, economics, et cetera. It's vitally important to global trade. At the same time, it's a localized source of air pollution. What have you been doing to kind of obviously grapple with this, to address this issue in your area?
Sure, thank you. I think that you framed it well. We are an economic engine for the region, for the state, and for the country. 1 in 5 jobs in Long Beach is attributed to the port, and that's really important. But as we all know, that economic success has come with environmental impacts. And the port, since 2005, when we adopted our green port policy, is when we really shifted how we look at port operations, port development, and port systems in a way to ensure that we are doing it as sustainably as possible. And then we followed it in 2006 with the first Clean Air Action Plan, the Harbor Department's CAP. And that really at the time, to be honest, was focused on criteria pollutants. It was focused on those pollutants, diesel particulate matter, NOx, SOx, the things that were impacting the health of the community around us. And that was really localized, right? It's as localized as West Long Beach to the greater LA air basin. And that was our focus because it was the imminent threat and the imminent need. But as we had great success reducing those emissions, in 2017, we really grappled with, okay, we really have to tackle greenhouse gases, right? And so in 2017, we updated the Clean Air Action Plan to include zero emission goals to further reduce NOx emissions as well as greenhouse gases. And so we now have goals to have cargo handling at the port be zero emission by 2030, and all the drayage trucks serving the ports being zero emissions by 2035. Because we realize that while we are an economic engine, while we are a supplier of jobs, while we're a supplier of all the things we like to buy and have been buying in the pandemic, we have to make sure we're doing our part to address the climate and the health impacts that the goods movement has on the local community and the world. And so we've been absolutely focused on that. And based on the success we had with our first Clean Air Action Plan, I'm very confident that we'll be successful going forward to meeting our goals. One thing I want to follow up on that was said previously is I think it's right. The human impact and your daily life impact is very important. But we also have to look at this from a systems impact. Because at the port, for example, in order to address the emissions of greenhouse gases and reduce those, we are relying more and more on the grid, right? And as we're relying more on the grid and climate is causing us to have hotter days and not be able to sleep, we're using more and more power. And so we saw, last summer how there were brownouts. And so I think that, what we need to do both locally and regionally is really look at the entire system and make sure that we're addressing each piece of it and then and addressing it in a very holistic manner, because it is important that people get the sleep they need and have the power they need. It is important that we electrify our equipment to reduce emissions, but then what does that mean for the grid? And what does that mean for supplying green power that in itself isn't causing more emissions? And so I think really taking that holistic picture is a challenge, but it's really what we're going to have to do to tackle the problem.
Okay, that's an excellent point. And actually, let me swing this over to Todd and thinking about it also from kind of that investment standpoint. You work with obviously nonprofits and for-profits.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about investments that you're making Pacific Six to try to address some of these issues in different ways.
Absolutely. At Pacific Six, we are impact investors. So the way we look at it is, if you look at the investment equation, everything we do has to be at least equally equal parts profit and benefit to society. We don't do things just for profitability. Every project that we take on has to benefit the folks in the areas where we are, as well as benefit the company itself. So we kind of take a three-pronged perspective on how we deal with the environment and green issues: education, investment, and implementation. On the education side, we own the Long Beach Post and the Long Beach Business Journal. While we do keep a very strong line between our journalism side and the company that owns it, to make sure that they are completely impartial when they report, it's very important to us that they report on environmental issues. In fact, recently, last year, they did a wonderful multiple-part reporting series on specifically how climate change is going to affect Long Beach. If you haven't seen it, look it up. It's in-depth and absolutely impactful and revealing. Secondly, to your point about the investments we make, our investment arm is very, very green-oriented. Specifically, to what Matt was talking about earlier with the port, we are heavily invested in a company called AEG, which is an advanced maritime emission control system, wherein we utilize barges to actually come up to the container ships and scrub emissions. We're working on that project right now. We're invested in a company called Waste to H, which converts solid waste into hydrogen. We are also invested in a company called Symbrosia, and Symbrosia uses a grown seaweed product. You add just a sprinkling to cow feed, and it reduces the methane gas from cattle by 90%. And I don't know if anyone's aware, but cow burps are one of the leading contributors to methane gas in the world. On the other side of the cow burps is our investment in aquaculture. Pacific Ocean Aqua Farms. We are well on the road to becoming the first American company to be licensed by the federal government to do a fin fish farm in U.S. federal waters. The other part of that, of the cow burp scenario, is there is a global protein crisis, and we find fin fish farming is a clean, efficient, environmentally friendly way to increase the protein needs to increase the supply of protein for America. So we're working on that, and 90% of the fish that we consume now is imported from fish farms around the world, and we're trying to address that. On the implementation side, every construction project that we're involved in has to be completely green, or as green as it possibly can be. For our Long Beach projects right now, we own the Breakers Hotel and the Ocean Center building. They're both adaptive reuse projects of historic buildings. So we have completely gutted each building and we're implementing completely brand new, environmentally friendly mechanical and electrical and plumbing. The MEP systems will all be brand new. Even on the investment side and on the financing side of that of these projects, we utilize PACE financing, which is a property assessed clean energy financing, which is a wonderful way to finance a major project like this, wherein we get a favorable interest rate as long as we implement green systems within the project. It's paid back through property tax. And while it's kind of a new type of financing in the industry, it's really taking off, and it positively incentivizes contractors and developers to be involved in more green construction projects. So that's kind of where we are. We're all over the place, you can see. You thought I was diverse.
Yeah, and that's good. And I think, again, it shows the areas where we can, what we need to start to tackle. I mean, again, you kind of mentioned from construction to obviously emissions and obviously the grid and even food. Let me full.
Can I just add something to tie into that?
Sure, go
Because
ahead.
when Todd mentioned, the methane, that speaks directly to my acceleration point, because policy has focused on CO2, but methane heats the atmosphere 25 times as much. And only recently have we started giving credits and really having policy that gives credits to businesses that reduce methane. And so that runaway climate change means that you go after methane as fast as possible. So it ties to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And certainly that gets into the idea of waste, anything that goes into the landfill that becomes methane. And so as you said, it's a virtuous or perhaps invirtuous cycle if we're not looking at it holistically, as Matt had mentioned as well. Let me pull in Allison and Jennifer into the conversation as well, because they're working obviously on the citywide kind of comprehensive effort with the climate action and adaptation plan. And let me throw the question at you this way. And again, either one of you that want to kind of take the question on the one hand, we have this really progressive plan that you've put together, which is great. On the other hand, just recently, the city worked on the update of the general plan. And one of the things the city was really pushing for was more density, transit oriented development. I recall at the time, former city manager Pat West put a really articulate editorial in the Press Telegram about kind of urging kind of this new way of looking forward and thinking about the next generation, and the fact that, it's not going to all be single family homes. We need to change the way we look at it. There was a lot of pushback from the Long Beach community against this, against the general plan, against increased density. From the city's point of view, how do you kind of help nudge us as a community forward to this new version of what we're going to need to live like, and to get to what we're striving for in the climate action and adaptation plan?
Thanks, Stephen. So I'll just give a brief kind of how does this relate to our general plan, and I'll have Jennifer talk a little bit more about what is the CAP, and then kind of tie it to everything else we're doing. So to your point, we represent advanced planning, which oversees all the long range planning for the city, and planning, dictates the regulations for what can be built where and under what rules and restrictions. And of course, that's very important to this climate change conversation, because we know that 95% of our citywide emissions come from our transportation and building sectors. So that's about what gets built where people live versus where they work, what kind of trips they have to make to get their groceries. And then that last remaining 5% or so relates to the waste sector. Now, there are many different ways to measure and cut greenhouse gas emissions. So that's based on what's called a community-wide inventory, and Jennifer can talk about that a little more. But from that perspective, you can see why planning and land use decisions are really important to this question of climate change, especially at the city level. Now, as you sort of alluded to, the city just recently updated our general plan land use element, was adopted in December 2019. That's one required element of every city's general plan that really provides that long range vision of where are we going as a community and how are we going to get there. And it was a 15-year process in which there were many different perspectives in the community as to how we will plan for the future need for housing and jobs. We estimate the need for about 28,000 additional housing units in the next 10 or so years. And that's not just our estimate, that comes from the state and our regional housing needs assessment, as well as about close to 30,000 new jobs in that similar time frame. And so as we think about how do we facilitate that needed development, where can we do that best? We do focus on the need for transit-oriented development and the ability for people to live closer to where they work and to access those jobs. Part of the reason the state and the region give Long Beach such a large assessment or arena is because of that statewide recognition related to climate change, that we should continue to focus new development where jobs already exist, because we see as people get priced out, they end up in Lancaster or out in Riverside, commuting back to the LA area or to the port for the jobs because they can't afford the housing that is here in Long Beach. And so for those reasons, yes, we have a huge focus on facilitating transit-oriented development, and our land use element gets some progress in doing that, but not in all parts of our city, as you point out. However, the CAP is actually a mitigation measure of our land use element update that says, as we facilitate new development, how do we do that in the most sustainable way possible? But it's not only about new development, because to Dr. Crave's point earlier, older and substandard housing, where especially lower income and communities of color tend to live, tend to be where you have the least ability to adapt to and stay safe from climate change impacts. If you all remember that 2015 power outage we had in the downtown during a really bad heat wave, that turned out to be actually one of our worst extreme heat summers on record. And that multi-day power outage impacted high rises with seniors living in it, businesses who were disrupted for many days at a time. Those are the ways that we're seeing people already impacted by climate change. And with substandard housing and the lack of air conditioning or insulation, we see that people have less ability to be equipped for those issues. And only about 4% of our housing stock has been built since the year 2000. And so if you think about from the perspective of having those upgraded equipment and facilities and building in the most sustainable way possible, it's not only about new development, but also how do we facilitate the existing need and to help retrofit and improve existing buildings to address these issues, while also placing development in the right location so that people can better access jobs and resources. So with that general framing, I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer to talk a little bit more about the CAP.
Sure. So yeah, I'll just share a brief overview. So the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, the CAP, it was confirmed by City Council this past January. The team was working on it for years, did a lot of community outreach, had scientific, business, and community working groups that all informed drafting of the CAP. And the CAP helps us meet our state GHG reduction requirements, and also helps us meet our policy commitments to be a leader in city climate initiatives. And the way that the document is organized is around mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation is organized into buildings, transportation, and waste. And then adaptation, we did a climate stressors review, a vulnerability assessment that looks at extreme heat, air quality, drought, sea level rise, and flooding, all of these climate impacts that affect the city, and provides kind of a high level view of what the city can be doing across these categories to really integrate into other city plans and policies, creating incentives to help us both mitigate greenhouse gas emissions reductions, greenhouse gases to meet our reduction goal, and also to help the community adapt to climate change. So yeah, some of the things that we're doing, to speak to Matt's point, we're really taking, a systems level. So how does Long Beach as a community use more renewable energy? How do we transition the grid to more renewable energy? How do we reduce vehicle miles traveled community-wide? And how do we increase waste diversion? So we have a quantified strategy in the CAP to achieve some of those goals. And then we're also inviting the community to work with us to both mitigate GHGs and also adapt to climate change. And so we're looking forward to officially adopting the plan later in the year. We hope that everyone will support us and also get involved because now we move into implementation. And just to touch on some of the very interesting things that we're doing, one of them is developing an urban heat toolkit for the Washington neighborhood. One aspect of the CAP was looking at vulnerability. So we saw that extreme heat, if you lay out areas of the city that are impacted by extreme heat, and you also lay out the areas of the city that are considered more socially vulnerable based on race, income, and other factors, they're a pretty neat overlap. And so that's one of the things that we are really looking to address in the city, disproportionate environmental burden. We have economic assets within the city that the world and the region benefit from. And so how about making sure that people who might live next to these sources, economic generators and pollution sources, are also benefiting from that economic productivity. This neighborhood is anticipated to be hotter, and we're looking at ways that the built environment can help alleviate some of that heat. And then we're also looking at green jobs. We were just wrapping up a study done with some USC students yesterday, and they're looking at how the CAP can support green jobs. So that's one way that we're also welcoming the business community to really work with us on that. Hopefully, the CAP can help support a green economy and economic inclusion. And we're just looking at, ways to prioritize that, or, where to focus. So those are some of the things that I'm very excited about with the CAP.
So let me follow up on a couple of points you mentioned and kind of drill into the specifics and really, whether Jennifer, Allison, and Matt, from the city's perspective, the city itself is not creating greenhouse gases per se. It's the community perhaps you're regulating, or in the port's case, you're kind of you're managing all of these operations, but you're not doing them. How do you nudge these businesses or investments or organizations to get towards where we want to go? I mean, I imagine it's a carrot and stick approach, but what are some of the tools you have in your toolbox that you can push people in that direction to get where we need to be?
So I can start, and then maybe Matt, you can add on anything port related. But for the city, it is, as you mentioned, a carrot and stick approach, and it also is both about systems and individuals. So to Jennifer's point, systems are extremely important and where a lot of change can happen. And so the CAP calls for several updates to our regulations. And so from our regulatory framework, how can we require or incentivize, more efficient building, again, incentivizing new housing development near transportation, and ensuring that when new housing is developed, it's near access to services and jobs. So access to grocery stores, your daily trips, your healthcare services, as well as jobs for people to get to and from. And so updating those incentives and requirements in the city's regulatory framework, but also looking at what we can do to support individuals. And that's everything from, we know that close to 30% of trips are under, I think it's 3 miles. And so when it's possible, we know not everyone's gonna jump on a bike and go on every trip they're taking, but when it's possible to once or twice a week make a decision to walk or bike or take transit instead of a single vehicle trip, those things do add up, they do matter. As well as thinking about on the adaptation side, how to people prepare for things like that power outage or other impacts of sea level rise, because we know that climate change is already here, it's already impacting us, and that's only going to worsen. So whether it's signing up for Alert Long Beach so you're informed and you know what's going on and what you can do to react, or during that downtown power outage, those that were trained by CERT, the Community Emergency Response Team training that comes out of the city, those that were trained by CERT were able to check on their own neighbors and make sure that they were safe and got the emergency resources that they needed during that multi-day power outage, whether it was medication or food or water, et cetera. So those are a few things kind of on the personal level. And then of course, we are local government. Cities represent, I think, 70% of carbon emissions worldwide. So we are a very important part of this conversation, but we're not the only part. We don't have the deepest of pockets when it comes to government. And so working with the state and federal governments on how do we prioritize funding for climate mitigation and adaptation priorities, and how do we come up with as many co-benefits as possible. So this isn't just about making this a penalty and saying now we have to change everything else we're doing. It's about how can we use this as an opportunity to transition to a greener economy and maximize those co-benefits for addressing inequities that already exist in our community, environmental justice issues that already exist, by helping bring health and economic development opportunity through the creation of green jobs, through the ability to build new infrastructure that's going to help us both reduce our future emissions, but also adapt to the impacts of climate change that are already here and won't be going away, even if we, bring our emissions down to zero tomorrow. So those are a couple of things I would start with.
So I guess
I'll jump in after you.
Okay. So from the port's perspective, I think that the question you asked was ultimately the first question we had to ask ourselves in 2006, right? How do we get the change we want? When the Port of Long Beach, we are the harbor department of the city of Long Beach. We're an enterprise department. We are a landlord port, so we do not operate any of the equipment you see out there. We do not operate the terminals. We do not operate the drayage trucks. We don't own the drayage trucks or any of that equipment. The actual footprint of the harbor department and our, relatively small fleet and our small, relatively building compared to the overall emissions, it is a small slice. So what tools do we have in our toolbox, the carrots and the sticks, to affect change? And so the answer is, well, you got to be creative about it. And so I think that there are some there are some of the sticks. We do have long-term leases with our operators, where through business negotiation we can put requirements, for example, that they have zero emission handling equipment by 2030, and that type of thing. So we can put those in our leases. We have had the ability with the Clean Trucks program to have requirements for the trucks that can enter port terminals and put requirements on those so that they're cleanest trucks and eventually zero emissions trucks. So we do have a few of those, but quite honestly, I think that the biggest part of it is being the carrots, right? And I think that we have been very successful in finding creative incentive programs like our vessel speed reduction program that incentivizes vessels to slow down to 12 knots at 20 and 40 nautical miles, which has a huge emissions benefit when those ships slow down, both on the criteria pollutants and a huge benefit on greenhouse gases because they're burning less fuel. So that there's ways we can do that, and quite frankly, more than the dollar incentive that the shipping lines like on that, they like the acknowledgement. They like getting a green flag and getting that acknowledgement. So you have to be really creative, I think, about what your carrots and sticks are if you're not a regulatory agency. And so we've done that, and we've sought funding. Right now we've over the last couple of years been super successful in getting nearly $70 million in funding from the state, from CARB and CEC, to assist our tenants in demonstrating zero emissions technology, right? And so we are working with the terminal operators who do own the equipment to link up technology providers and the funding for these demonstration projects and helping see those through so that they can start early deployment and early demonstration. So I would say it is carrots and sticks, it's being creative, and it's looking for all the different ways you can just move the needle forward a little bit.
Todd, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, absolutely. From a developer's perspective, I'd like to say that the city of Long Beach has been incredibly supportive in suggesting greener ways to develop. In fact, we're presently working on 3 affordable housing projects in the city of Long Beach. They're all going to be either affordable and achievable housing. So to address a point already made earlier, folks will be able to live closer to where they work. It's a shame that people have to move an hour's drive away from their jobs, and they should be part of the communities where they work. Each of our projects is going to be transit oriented. They will be very close to public transportation. We're going to provide bicycles if people wanted to use bikes, and generally, notwithstanding the incentives that the government provides, it's just the right thing to do. And I think more developers should do things because it's the right thing to do and not just for financial incentives.
Let me pull Dr. Kreva back into the conversation a little bit in the sense of, can you give us maybe some examples of what are we doing in Long Beach from your perspective, from your, if you will, global perspective of what we're doing well right now, given all these things that we've kind of just talked about from the city perspective, from investments, and perhaps what are some missing opportunities that we're not hitting at, that you've seen other jurisdictions, areas?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like too big a fan, but I am a big fan of Long Beach, but it's genuine because I moved here from Westwood. First of all, you have sidewalks. It's very walkable. And so Long Beach is kind of a gem of a community, frankly, having lived in maybe 20 other cities in the US. And it has a sense of community. And that's what it takes. It's not fractious. You know, this climate thing is a campaign. It's not just innovation, it's a campaign. And everybody has to do their bit, but they don't have to be told what bit they do. They just have to find their way of contributing. And I just like the spirit of Long Beach. But I would say the two things that I think could be really helpful is, and there's been some reference to them, is just information. Like on your smartphone, you know, information, daily information about temperatures, heat waves, air quality in a very local way, presented visually and compelling, not like a game, but still information day after day after day influences the public. When the US Embassy put their air quality monitors in Beijing, it changed the country's attitude towards pollution because they could just see the information. And, you know, there's a real opportunity for connecting to the community through just giving the community information in a way they're used to getting it, which is this. And it's very, very personal. And it would be about these things that matter and setting. And I know the Olympic Committee for Sustainability to 2028, it would like to develop this. So I think that's really important. And the other thing that I just found out that we're looking at the aquarium at really doing a better job with our organic waste, because for the many of the reasons talked about, but the technology lags there in terms of digesters and how you handle it. Well, one of the, you know, but I think we're eligible for a grant to get some help on that. But supporting innovation at that scale, you know, not at the giant infrastructure and grid scale. States and the federal government will take care of that. But a lot of innovation for climate change is going to be with things like organic digesters. Aquaculture is another example. Aquaculture is advancing, is getting better every year, partly because it's not a big giant project. Different aquaculture operators, it's like evolution. Each of them experiments. The ones that do well succeed. The ones that don't do well fall by the side. And cities are the right scale to support that type of innovation, and it also empowers people. So information, you know, to school kids, you know, when they walk into a school, they should know things from this, information for the community, and supporting local innovation that is entrepreneurial, but also for the climate. The Endangered Species Act got passed. The whole movement for it was because every day in all the newspapers, they put the number of whooping cranes at the front page. And people could see it, and they responded. So there's a really big role for that. And the city's got this sort of culture and commitment to do it.
Let me kind of throw the same question over to Jennifer and Allison. And Jennifer, I saw you on mute, so maybe you have something to add. But from your perspective, what are things that maybe we should be a little bit jealous of other cities of that we haven't kind of done yet? We don't have all the answers. Sounds like we have a lot of them, which is great. But what are some opportunities out there that we haven't been able to to pull in yet from that you've seen other cities do?
Well, I wanted to just jump on the opportunity on the air quality monitoring point to plug that there's a Smart City Challenge solicitation to work with us on air quality monitoring for 6 months. So we're asking tech companies to work with us for a 6-month pilot. Sometimes they turn into longer term contracts. To Allison's point, we don't have like deep pockets, but we are kind of putting out solicitations for people to help us with these efforts. And air quality monitoring is very important to us, especially in environmental justice communities. So look that up and share with your tech friends and apply. And one thing to respond to what I'm jealous of right now is we're looking at electrification and reach codes. There was a presentation recently that showed that 40+ cities in the Bay Area had some kind of reach code or net zero code, building energy code, and about 2 cities in Southern California. So that's something that we're exploring. I wish that we could do a little bit more right now, but we were reached out to by the AIA Long Beach chapter to look into electric buildings. Right now, there's been 1 permitted in the city of Long Beach. So, we're working with industry experts and others to, figure out how we might be able to better, encourage that kind of development.
And I would just add, I think Jennifer's got some great examples. I would just add, I think, we're starting the groundwork for it, but there are some other cities, there's programs like Richmond Builds, and then other cities who are looking at their COVID recovery from a green economy perspective. Like, there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of people out of work. How do we match those things together and get the right set of incentives and business support and entrepreneurship to help match those things and help us truly, increase our transition to a green economy. The time is now, and from a local government perspective, we have more and different dollars than we're used to, even though we're also in a budget crunch. And so again, it's about how do we think about the pie differently and how we can create really great co-benefits to help invest in communities that have been most impacted by climate change and will continue to be. I mean, I think we touched on this briefly, but we've made such great progress related to air quality since the early 90s, but climate change and extreme heat impacts threaten to undo almost all of our progress if that's not curbed. And so as we think about how to prioritize and invest in those communities that are most impacted, how can we really take this opportunity to create more green jobs and to help address some of these health disparities?
Let me at this point take an audience question. If you, from the audience, feel free to throw in questions if you have. We have a question from Pat Welch. He asked, does this move away from brick and mortar retail that we've seen in the last year towards online ordering and delivery, does it help or hurt climate change? And I'll open up to any of you all if you have kind of a sense of that. And maybe Matt, start with you, because a lot of it is coming through the port, this new change.
I think I'll start by caveating, I'm the environmental guy, not the operations guy. So I'm not going to wade in too deep because I don't want to get it wrong. But my overall sense is in the long from the goods movement sector that we as the port kind of take credit for in our emissions inventory, the vessels 40 nautical miles out, the trains to the border, to the dredge structure to the warehouse, that kind of bit, not necessarily from the warehouse to your door. I think in the long term, it shouldn't make a difference one way or the other, because our goal is to clean up that piece of the goods movement sector, right? So we are going to be operating zero emissions cargo handling equipment in the ports at 2030, regardless of how that package finally gets delivered to the end recipient. So I think in the long run, from the port's perspective and from kind of the emissions we look at, I don't think it would have an overall impact. I will say though that every time that there is the supply chain is very complex and it takes a while to get in its groove and make things really efficient. And every time there's a change, going from more the Amazon, ordering patterns to versus the brick and mortar, it does cause some temporary maybe adjustments that need to be happen in the supply chain. And those adjustments always, efficiency is the key to environmental sustainability, right? So there could be some temporary higher maybe emissions associated with any change, but I don't think they're long-term.
Let me sort of jump in on that. And first I'll say, I don't think any of us really know the answer because it's complicated, but I'm not ducking the question. Because what it is it could be a switch that allows us to get better at things. You know, ships, for example, are the most efficient way to transport goods. Most of your emissions come from the trucks in the city, not from the ships transporting the goods. So, you know, getting something from far away is not a climate liability necessary. The big thing is supply chains. Matt hit it, and COVID reinforces that. Nike, when Nike got embarrassed maybe 30, 40 years ago and really started paying attention, they know their supply chains, and they found out they were more profitable by knowing their supply chains and knowing where everything came from. COVID made us aware of supply chains. If we start incorporating into our thinking about supply chains this environmental impact, the potential to make a difference at a global scale is huge. You know, we ship out stuff. We order almost probably like a lot of people for our retail from Amazon. But what we don't know, what we can't figure out is the environmental impact of those goods. And we need a system to kind of quantify the environmental impact of goods, because market research shows people will pick the more environmentally friendly goods, but we actually don't have the data. So I think it could be, you know, there's a huge opportunity here combined with some research. Right now, we don't know. People have a lot of misconceptions about Amazon. They pay a lot of attention. The overnight is more efficient than in terms of emissions than the slow delivery. And it's because they optimize their routes. So you'd think I'm ordering something overnight and it's worse for the climate. It's just the opposite. But there's a lot of non-intuitive stuff out there. And I think supply chains from a business perspective and environmental perspective are kind of like, if I were a student, that's what I would be studying now in both business programs and science programs, is that.
Okay. Let me pull Todd back in and thinking a little bit about, from your work on local community organizations, even DLBA, what role should they have? Now, you know, organizations like DLBA, your Library Foundation, you know, they have their own mandates, but where should climate fit in, kind of layered on top of those things? And again, it's a complex issue. We've talked about a couple other issues of, you know, economic justice, environmental justice, and how do we balance some of these issues? Where should local nonprofits be, you know, inserting themselves in this kind of conversation?
I think this is certainly not my area of expertise, but from my perspective, participation and education. You have to put your money where your mouth is, and you have to do the right thing in regard to green practices, and absolutely it's education to let people know, and supporting like with the DLBA. Supporting these developments that we're putting together to make a greener Long Beach. I wish I had more to say on it, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. And I don't know, maybe from the city, Jennifer, Allison, from your perspective, balancing those issues. Dr. Correva kind of mentioned in the beginning, these are sometimes going to be disproportionately hit on the people that can least afford the change. How does the city help balance that? How do we facilitate that transition where it is going to be difficult? It's going to cost money to do it, and not everyone has the money to make that change as we adapt.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question that certainly we put a lot of thought into in developing the plan, and we're definitely not the only experts in the room on that. That was a big important part of the conversation with the community in developing the plan, as well as in looking at best practices as we were thinking about strategies. And there's a couple things to consider. One is kind of how to take an equity approach to centering communities most impacted by climate change in the decisions that we're making, and having them be part of identifying solutions that work. There's a lot of great intended climate programs out there that have fantastic ideas or rebates or things that can really create opportunity for people, but may not be well utilized because they're not culturally competent, or they're not actually addressing the heart of the challenge. I'll just give one small example. We had both a scientific working group, a community working group, and a business working group that helped inform development of the CAP. And someone on our science working group is a professor at Cal State Long Beach who said, hey, as you're thinking about cooling centers related to extreme heat, at first this is just one of 60 actions in the plan, and we're thinking just high level, where do we have cooling centers, and what do we need to do to expand those and increase access? And he mentioned, it's not just about where they're located, but what hours they're available, how people are going to get there, whether they're comfortable leaving their home or apartment unattended during a heat wave, even if they are experiencing extreme heat impacts, language spoken, et cetera. So, that's one consideration on one action where we need to be thinking about how to train our own employees, how we could potentially partner with church and faith-based organizations that already have locations out there that could act as cooling centers, how, again, we can, if we're going to make these investments, help create green jobs, and local community members who are best at making and building connections with their own community to be able to help us run these centers as best as possible. As kind of one piece of it. And then I mentioned earlier, again, communities that are already most impacted by environmental injustices are also projected to be most vulnerable to climate change impacts. And so by taking the approach of centering and focusing on those communities with the greatest risk first, and making those investments there, it does allow us to take that prioritization that's necessary to, again, we need a citywide approach, and many of our codes and updates will relate to citywide issues. But as we think about community-based investments and place-based investments, they do need to be in communities with the greatest risk today and in the future. Anything to add, Jennifer?
And we actually got an audience question that kind of, I'm sorry, let me throw this in, just audience question that kind of builds on that. And they kind of added a perspective of, how the city, and I would say, really any of the organizations are addressing kind of this balancing act of the issues of housing, homelessness, environment, health, on top of climate, and the way they've kind of phrased it is almost climate gentrification, and the fact that there's going to be migration, refugees. We have, at the convention center. How do we balance these different issues where, if you think of it in a global perspective, a lot of the countries that are going to be hardest hit can least afford the changing temperature and impacts. And what should we be doing, thinking locally and residents of Long Beach, but then broader, if you will, citizens of the U.S., residents here in the U.S. should be doing to advocate or help address this perhaps imbalance, and really open it up to any of you all. Any thoughts on that? It's a complicated issue, and it's obviously deeper than anything that perhaps the city of Long Beach specifically can do. But how do we start to think about that? And Allison, you kind of, I think, addressed it. Part of it is kind of putting that into our thinking. In any other perspectives from folks?
So I think we should give ourselves some credit, because 10 years ago, we weren't even having this conversation. And the fact that we're having this conversation shows quite an awakening. The second thing I would say is the Washington State had a carbon tax, and the whole campaign was sort of framed in terms of pitting the wealthy, liberal, climate activists against the poor communities and the communities of color that were going to be hurt. When you looked at how they voted, the communities of color voted in favor of the carbon tax. The non-communities of color voted against it. The lowest income voted in favor of the carbon tax. The highest income voted against it. So some of our even assumptions about different sectors are wrong. But I think we've actually come a long way. I would suggest the word fairness. we use equity. It's not going to be, you can't have equal, you got to think about fairness. I like that word. And in the global community with nations, in the dialogue for national negotiations, they're starting to use the word fairness. So it's not about, tit for tat, this checkbook, this balance and that. And I think if we embrace the ethic of fairness as we consider our policies, we'll do okay. We're not there, but we're more conscious of it than we were 10 years ago by an order of magnitude.
From a business perspective, the work that I've done with the Convention and Visitors Bureau, COVID taught us that while we could adapt, that we could do hybrid types of conventions where it would be positive for the environment by fewer and fewer people having to come here and creating a high quality virtual convention. That on the business side and on the community side also has a negative impact. Our local businesses, our local restaurants, our local hotels, having full participation in a Long Beach convention fills the businesses, it fills the hotels, it fills the restaurants. So it's a dual-sided coin, and I love what Dr. Peter was saying about fairness. It's a balance, and we are talking about it, and we're working on it, and it's something that we need to strive for. But it's not an easy question to answer.
Let me pull in another. Sorry, Allison, you're going to add something real quick?
Just really briefly, at the local level, I just want to say that I think the housing crisis around people experiencing homelessness, green gentrification, that is all interrelated, even though they sometimes do feel like disparate issues. They're interrelated in both the causes of the problems and the solutions that can be out there. And the housing crisis is manyfold, but one of the pieces is the lack of sufficient supply of housing. We know that over 20,000 households in Long Beach already experience overcrowding above the federal definition. And those are also in substandard housing units. So there are too many people living in the unit, and they're older structures that are energy inefficient and not set up for things like air conditioning and some of those systems and structures we talked about earlier. For people experiencing homelessness, it's a multitude of issues, including how to address mental health and impacts of trauma and some systems level stuff. But it's also about, units and beds and having that supply and having that access to housing. And so as we think about how do we, address the need for housing in our community, I don't think anyone has the answer as it relates to the issue of green gentrification. However, in LA County, there is this Measure A across the county for funding for how do you prioritize park development and alongside housing development to help try to combat, green gentrification and gentrification impacts that are out there. And certainly gentrification is, a human rights issue of our time. It's a challenge across the whole country, and it's not one that I think anyone has a easy solution for. It again has to be part of the conversation, just like climate does. But one of the things in our CAP that we've made a primary strategy was how to prioritize, as we do transit-oriented development, really prioritizing affordable housing near transit, because we know that people who live in affordable housing have higher rates of using transit and are more likely to use, make use of the benefits of that locational possibility. So just wanted to point that out at the local level.
Let me ask another question. Can you hear me? Let me ask another question that kind of almost takes us back a year. We all want to kind of forget about 2020. It was a rough year for everyone, but there are a couple bright spots. They may have been small, but there are a couple bright spots. For example, my wife, who works for Kaiser, had to go into the office every day, work on the front lines of COVID. Highways were great to drive on last year. The periods of time when you were able to go to a restaurant and sit outdoors, that was pretty nice. There, dining outside, there are some real interesting things that shifted. We were outside more. Long Beach has got the climate to do that. How do we keep the best of last year, whether it's from the planning perspective, how we're kind of maybe shifting more to walkable, walk-centric cities as opposed to car-centric cities? how do we keep that? How do we keep some of those good things that happened last year, maybe by accident, but nonetheless were kind of a pleasant surprise into the future?
I'm so glad you brought this up. When we were doing our annual report for our general plan, and particularly the land use element for 2020, I mean, what a year to summarize. And there were, of course, huge challenges and things that still need to be addressed, but there were some unique opportunities, as you point out. I mean, our roads are our largest amount of public space. So when we're talking about park space and public space, roadways and rights of way really by far are the largest amount of public space that we have as a city and community. And so, you know, our general plan and our planning strategies, and you've seen this in the downtown for many years now, really do focus on how do we create a more multimodal experience for people to make it more comfortable and pleasant to walk and bike. And that's not just about what the destinations are, which are important and where those are located, but also what the experience is on the street and sidewalk. So as we saw the opportunity to vastly increase the amount of outdoor dining and outdoor parklets that were created for a variety of businesses, I do think there's opportunity to step back and say, you know, how do we take the best of these and make them more permanent? Because this was where we were going as a city in our planning framework already. And we do know that creating those, you know, spaces on the street, eyes on the street, increases perceptions of safety. It increases local sales tax generation. It increases the likability of the neighborhood, and it creates opportunity for people to, again, walk, bike, and have those more local destinations. Another one, we talked a little bit about city leadership. Again, most of the greenhouse gases citywide may not be attributable to the city directly, but we do have impacts related to our facilities and the transportation of our employees. 2020 was the first year ever that our city actually met our TDM, or transportation demand management, goals because of the working from home and working remotely. And we know not every job is going to be done remotely forever, but it did have a huge impact on our city's carbon footprint, our municipal carbon footprint, to have people working remotely when they were able to conduct their jobs to do so. Of course, some city employees like Stephen's wife still were in the field and working all year because we needed them to be there. But you know, not every job necessarily has to be done from the office. So just wanted to hit on those couple.
Yeah, I'm trained as a conservation biologist. All around the world, people were seeing mountains they never saw before. You know, bird populations, fish populations. And it reminds us that, yeah, we could damage the environment, but the environment could also recover. And there's something positive about that. And biologists were surprised by how fast. They weren't surprised that it happened, but it happened really fast. And that's a good signal. The other thing I'd say is, Matt started this by talking about systems. And I think what COVID has taught us and what climate has taught us is these problems we face now, they're system problems, and we can trade lessons. To me, it's all about information education. That's one. We screwed that up with COVID. And we didn't do a good job of that. It created some confusion. Communities have to respond, and behavior change. So COVID requires good information and education, a community response and behavior change. That's exactly what responding to climate does. And if we get good on all those dimensions, and people are much more thoughtful about it. So when we think about climate in this sort of system way, and it needs all this, I think we're going to get smarter. I think in 2 years, collectively, we'll be smarter after we process everything we've learned.
Let me bring in another audience question from John Kindred, and I'll paraphrase this a little bit. We're trying to find these answers and figuring out some of these problems that we're facing. What are we doing to bring in students? Perhaps that work on clubs, organizations, with the City of Long Beach, other community organizations. How can we work with this next generation, get the conversations going, and getting them working together to help solve some of these problems?
I just want to mention one specific program because it's cool. It's coming up. We're doing a high school film festival for Long Beach. We have 60 high school films with maybe 150 high school students, and we'll show them publicly. They're 3 minutes because that's my attention span, and it's about thriving in the future climate. and it engages them. They learn science. I've seen the films. We have judges, and it'll be virtual this year, but we hope to have this every year where high school students can contribute creatively. And you should see what they did. I mean, then they are amazing. So that's just one fun thing.
Yeah, and I know that our local schools were involved in developing the CAP. At this point, we're really looking to explore what that's going to look like in the implementation phase. So, we're engaged with students. Often we're working with these USC students now, and we have some Climate Corps fellows through AmeriCorps right now. And one idea that they've been really championing is a youth climate ambassador program. So we're figuring out, who our partners who want to work with us, and kind of prioritizing some efforts to carry forward into implementation. So that's an invitation to reach out to us and explore ways that we can work together.
Yeah, one of the things we learned in developing the CAP was actually our scientific working group helped us better connect with students and youth because many of them are professors and are connected with educational institutions. And so as part of developing the CAP, we did both work with Long Beach Unified, Cal State Long Beach, and the City College to work with students, as well as the aquarium. The aquarium and Leadership Long Beach partner on a Youth Leadership Long Beach program that's very focused on climate change. And they come up with some fantastic ideas and campaigns. We had a group of high school students who did their own social media campaigns for the CAP. We worked with Long Beach Unified to be part of their annual science fair, which is still taking place virtually. And the winning science projects were displayed at some of our larger CAP campaign festivals, like our CAP festivals during the outreach process. And so, as we talk about this equity lens, communities most impacted by climate change, of course, our next generation is inheriting this crisis and will be central to the solution. And so we recognize the need to work more with young people. And I'm so glad for the question, because it does take effort, but they come up with just incredible ideas, and often our most energetic audiences when we talk about some of these dense, big ideas and policy ideas.
And they're nowhere near as boring as I am or my generation is when they talk about it.
Let me take another question. This is from Seth, and it was addressed to Allison, but I think this is really open to anyone. The question is more or less, the city, but any workplace, are you guys considering some type of hybrid work from home model post-COVID that will kind of address some of the benefits that we saw in 2020 and hopefully kind of provide the best of both worlds, and really help to reduce greenhouse gases and vehicle miles traveled, et cetera. And I'll just speak for myself. I have an office, and it's a small group. We have 15 people, and we're remote. We actually have an office in Oakland and elsewhere. And we've decided that we've made it fully optional. A little bit easier for us, only 15 people. But how are you all dealing with it? Matt, maybe I can pull you in. I don't know if you have a sense from the port. How much do people need to be there? How much flexibility has there been? And then other people can kind of chime in as well.
So I'll jump in a little bit. I do know, the Port of Long Beach, we are, again, the harbor department of the city. And I know the city right now is going through its back to work plan and what that looks like. And I know that they are taking a lot of considerations into account. And so that process is ongoing. I am not informed in that process, but I know it's ongoing. I would say that I have been extremely impressed by the harbor department's ability to it wasn't smooth in the first 2 weeks, but after the first 2 weeks were over, the ability to adapt and work from home so productively. My team has not skipped a beat. It took, we were a little bit of an old school organization. Most people had desktop computers, not laptop computers. Most people didn't have cell phones. So we did a lot of, wet signatures on things. So it took a little while to adjust to that. But once we did, people are adaptive and creative. And I think that, again, we haven't skipped a beat and we are as productive as we've ever been. And I think that that does, going back to the conversation that we were having earlier of just all the lessons learned, right? We have to pick the things that worked well, the things that maybe we don't want to continue, and find the best path forward.
Pacific 6 is completely flexible. We like to have one person here to answer the phone in case something happens, but our folks work from home, come to the office if you have a meeting, and being kind of like a little family. We like to gather, at least now that we're all vaccinated, we like to gather once a week. So my son, who is a university student but stuck in Long Beach for the rest of the year, we have a griddle out back, and he cooks us lunch one day a week so we can all be together. But other than that, we let people work as they need to, and productivity has not suffered one bit.
Yeah, and we're struggling, we're thinking about this for the aquarium. Obviously, we have people that have to be here to take care of the animals. But and I know at UCLA they were as well. I think it's every business is going to come up. I think there's certainly an advantage to being together. If you're never together, it builds trust, and it does that. My personal, but I have to work with the HR VP. I tend to think of at UCLA, what I set up for the program was 3 days a week. You're there Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and so you can count on seeing people. And then if you want to work remotely, Monday and Friday, and think about the emissions that cuts and the personal family time that offers. But it still allows, at a lot of institutions, you do need signatures and things to be passed around. But I think it's going to be fascinating. I think the hardest thing is going to make sure employees don't resent privileges given to other employees because they have different jobs, and there can't be a cookie cutter approach. It can't just, so it's going to, your job is going to carry with it something associated with remote or not remote. And I don't think we thought of that so much before.
Another audience question. Is the wording climate change, is it out of date? Should we be now using the word climate crisis, given where we're at and where we're going and the urgency of the need?
I say yes, it's out of date. I call it climate disruption now. I don't like crisis because sometimes crisis can feel too, but it's a disruption of everything. So I call it climate disruption, but climate change sounds like global warming. I lived in New York State, that sounded good.
I was going to say, I'm originally from Massachusetts, and when I first started working on these issues in the early 2000s, global warming was a hard framing to sell and to share with people and have them understand why that was an issue. I would just agree that climate disruption is, I think, more evocative of the situation that we're in, and sharing both the level of need and the fact, as Peter's pointing out, that there still is opportunity to address it.
Here's a fun fact for everyone that I just recently learned. The term climate change was actually coined by a Republican political strategist because global warming sounded too serious. They wanted to lighten it up a little bit so people wouldn't believe in it as much. NPR, listen to it.
Another question from our audience. Are there any toolkits, languages, best words that people can kind of access and really start to talk about this in terms of how we need a change in talking to our families or friends to kind of get the urgency towards making changes? And is there a best way of influencing people to change?
So we have an education program that's connected. It's connected. It had been funded by the National Science Foundation, and it's connected to all the zoos and aquaria. And they tried to trade lessons. And they do have a toolkit for how to talk about it, mainly informally, like when kids come through. So it's not a stand up in front of a classroom toolkit. It's a conversational toolkit, if you will. It's pretty good and it's getting better. And we did another film festival and we could share the films with aquaria around the country, trying out 3-minute films about climate change. And we're going to evaluate which ones work best. So there's a lot of learning going on, but what you're asking, what that person is asking for is a really good thing to ask for. It's a really, efforts around the country and institutions are working on it. I don't think they've coalesced around the magic answer, but there is coalescence around how to get better at it.
I've been meaning to revisit the, I think it's the footprint calculator. It estimates your GHG emissions based on life cycle. I think I took it like years ago, and back then I was like vegan and biked everywhere, and it was still like 2.5 planets. Just, yeah, some of it's just by living here in the US. So, something like that I think can be pretty enlightening around personal choices. In response to that question, I would also say, kind of look to your own community, like you're here, so, you're aware of the climate change issues, and, thinking about, your own community. Where I live, it's very, Chinese and Vietnamese and very immigrant. And I did like kind of this small project looking at yards and how people were not doing, lawns, and they were instead, growing food or, doing other things. And that in itself, I mean, like lawns use up so much water. And that's, something that I think comes from my community that is a good example of, a strategy against climate disruption, change crisis. So yeah, there's like a lot of wealth in our own communities, and taking some of the issues that you learn about and kind of adapting that and making it relevant to your community, I hope is part of this work and conversation.
Culture and community matters. One dramatic example, in my old job, I had to go to Texas and talk about climate change. And I looked up how many high school football practices were canceled because of heat. And I could just talk about that. And suddenly people were not resistant.
So we have time for one last question, and I'm going to kind of throw this out to everyone, and perhaps everyone can kind of give a soundbite on it. And really, it's what can we leave our audience at the individual level? What can individuals do? Say I'm a resident of downtown Long Beach, I'm a business owner, whether it's advocacy or an action that I can take specifically, any kind of one kind of tidbit to kind of that they can walk away from so that they can do their part and do something for climate action.
Language or education or vocabulary notwithstanding, be the example of the change you want to see. People will follow if you set a good example. I'll shut up now.
I think, it's kind of been one of the big themes of this whole discussion is that it takes a lot of different approaches, right? So it takes regulation, it takes political motive, it takes industry and businesses stepping up and doing the right thing. It takes the community and your own actions, right? And so I think that the best thing any of us can do is figure out what of those pieces of change interest us and tackle it, right? Whether it's, maybe you're already politically involved and you can run on these policies, or you can talk to your city council or assemblyman or whatever it is, or just, whether you're a business person and you can contribute in some way, or to what we've just said, how do I change my lawn to make a bigger difference? I think that we each need to find the avenue that we think we can have the most impact and follow it.
Jennifer Allison, from city perspective.
I'm hoping you all can hear me because this is one of the negatives of working from home. I've got a lawnmower right outside my window, so hopefully I'll keep it brief. Hopefully you can hear me. I think we touched on a few throughout, but you know, there are small changes that can have meaningful impacts, and that was one of the campaigns that we included with the CAP, and that was based on some communications research that's out there about how to balance the magnitude of the issue without completely overwhelming people to the point where they don't feel that they can act or they feel kind of hopeless in it. And so you know, our tagline during development of the plan was small change, big impact for that purpose. And there are also big changes that need to be made, but small changes can be meaningful. Some of them we talked about are picking 1 or 2 trips a week that you would typically drive alone and either carpooling, taking transit, walking or biking when possible, purchasing locally, which can also, you know, support our local economy. Of course, supporting the final adoption of the CAP, which will come back to City Council in late fall as we move towards implementation. And one last one I would also recommend is thinking about how do you get to really understand the impacts of communities, environmental justice communities that again are being and will be most impacted by climate change. You know, there are some great community-based organizations that do, for example, environmental justice tours or ways for people to learn more and understand what's happening in communities like West Long Beach. And so I know that's been really important in my education and learning as well. So I would recommend that too.
Yeah, I second all of the above. I guess I would just add, maybe get to know your neighbors. I think just seeing with the power outage that Long Beach had in 2015, and also during COVID, you know, a lot of people were able to help each other out, and those networks are really important with like climate disaster as well.
And let me give Dr. Kariva the last word here. Thoughts?
Yeah, I actually thought Todd did it so well, but I'd say we all have to do something. Don't be a freeloader, but just find your own way that suits you. And if we all do something, to turn it around. But if there's too many freeloaders, it's not going to work.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. Really appreciate the thought. Really just scratch the proverbial tip of the iceberg on this issue. But really, I think the end of the day is we all need to take action. It really takes all of us. So let me throw it back to Brock. Appreciate everyone's time. Appreciate the audiences joining in and listening to this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That was fascinating. A really great conversation and went in so many different directions. Thanks to the panel. Very insightful, very informative discussion on climate disruption. New term that I'm going to incorporate, obviously, a little kind of brush some of the cobwebs off my language as it comes to this. And thanks also to Stephen. Great job as a moderator. Ready to move it around to everyone. Appreciate the conversation and the questions you brought to it and incorporating our audience from home. You know, my parents used to say that the greatest asset perhaps of humankind was our ability to innovate. It's what sets us apart. And that whether it's out of greed, whether it's out of altruism, whether it's out of community, that innovation is an amazing tool that we have at our disposal. But I quite like what I heard from Dr. Kariva earlier today when he stated, this is a campaign. This is a campaign. And being someone who's comes from politics and campaigns, I can completely appreciate that comment. Everyone has to have a role. And as you were all saying, those roles are large and small. Today, we've heard from institutions, agencies that have a large role in what's happening, but there's a trickle-down effect. There are other roles to be had. And we just, I think, as a community, need to help each other find our roles. And then, as was said, don't sit on the sidelines, get involved. These partners have found their roles. DLBA and the community, I think, are going to help each other find our roles moving forward. And, you know, as some of us on this call or on this Zoom session might say, there's times when our ability to be comfortable with technology is not the same as the youth who have grown up with that same technology, and it's like an appendage to them. You know, I think the same thing is going to happen here. on the topic, climate disruption and the innovation that needs to occur, I think that we'll see a lot from the youth. But we're showing here in this conversation that there's a lot of teachers and there are a lot of role players. So thank you all. Thanks to our audience for participating today. Really appreciate it, and stay tuned for more. Take care, everyone.